French, but he was a Marshal of France and a very fine person. And we became friendly. And he was nice enough on several occasions to include me in parties that he gave, and we became friends. I can't even think of his name now, but he was a one-armed Marshal of France, and I'm going to look up his name. Now, if you ask me any other questions that you want, I'll try to answer the questions. What I've just given you is roughly this, that I saw General MacArthur by using the emperor, and the people's devotion to the emperor kept Japan from becoming a communist country. The Russians were determined that Japan become a communist country. The French were determined to take their side in Vietnam, and they pushed us into the Vietnam business. The other countries, Russia, when they couldn't put the Russian troops in there, take over a certain section, never sent any troops. All they had was a delegation at the International Prosecution Section, and they had a Russian, the name was Derivanko, and he was at the United Nations when the United Nations was organized, and I found out that wherever the English language was spoken, they always sent him there. He was either the number 2 or the number 3 man at the Russian delegation, because they thought he knew the English language well enough to know any kind of hidden text there was into an English word that could be used. So he was there. He was responsible. The Chinese wanted Henry Puyi to be over and testify, and he was solely responsible for my being able to get Henry Puyi to get over there. The Chinese wanted him, and I don't know how much good he did, but he told me that he'd been a captive all of his life, and had been a captive since he was 2 years old. He had no idea why he was there in Japan for these trials. I'm convinced of that. But he was there for about 6 months.
Did you take an active part in the trials, or did you just arrange all of this?
I'm not a lawyer. I didn't think I could go into the trials and sit down there and listen to anything I wanted to listen to. Or I talked behind the scenes to various people. They wanted something done, but I didn't participate in the trial.
Well, what about General MacArthur? I know he was advised of all of this, but did he ever go to any of the trials?
As far as I know, the general never attended any trial. I don't think he ever attended any trial. He knew what was going on. He knew that from Courtney Whitney and from Larry Bunker, and what he could read in the papers and whatever copies of cables that would come in that would interest him, why he would. His people thought would be of interest to him, what he would see. So he was up to date on what took place, but I don't think he ever participated. Well, he'd had these people who could do whatever he wanted done. Mm-hmm. And MacArthur's sole determination was the rebuilding of Japan, and that was what. And he was determined it wasn't going to become a communist country. Now that's just all I can say, and he was able to do it.
Well, why don't we stop right there?
Okay.
And. Testing. Wait a minute. Okay. Now, you want this put on tape. Let me get a little bit closer to you.
This is an amusing story because I saw this on the corner in Japan of the Ginza in what would be the equivalent corner of 42nd and Broadway in New York City. There was a fire down several blocks away, and the Japanese fire department started to go down to this fire, and these little bit of dinky engines that they still had in those days stalled right in the middle of 42nd and 5th Avenue, and it didn't take long for about 5,000 GIs to gather there and to give them advice to how to start this little engine. And this Jap was out there with great big hip boots on trying to crank it, and all the GIs were hollering and whooping. And in about 2 minutes, a great big GI truck that had been converted into a fire truck came lumbering down and put the fire out. And I thought about what the missionaries had told us, what a wonderful fire department the Japanese had. That might have been a good fire department somewhere in the 20s or 30s, but it did not compare to any modern updated fire department. And I couldn't keep from laughing to save my soul with all these GIs giving them encouragement. By that I mean every kind of conversation in the world was taking place.
Well, when you were talking about the missionaries, that's to be in quotes, isn't it? What were the missionaries? Who were they that gave you this wrong information?
These were missionaries who had been in Japan before war started, and there were various different denominations who had volunteered to be able to give advice about Japan to troops that were going to Japan. And the reason I laughed about it, you couldn't help but feel very funny after you'd been in Japan for a while to think about the advice that you had been given and how to act and how to do, because none of that fit into the present day situation in which we were the occupying powers of Japan. And I couldn't help but laugh about the time and effort that the missionaries had wasted on giving this advice. And this advice primarily took place in Honolulu, and next it took place at various installations in this country where they knew the troops there were going to be sent to Japan.
Because you said these particular missionaries, I think, had talked to you when you were at Eglin Field, I believe. I think you said that.
We talked to them right after we had witnessed
that.
the mock fire bombing of Eglin, at Eglin Field of Tokyo. And I couldn't help but laugh about what we were given. That was what that was.
I see. Well, I know you have a lot of other stories to tell me. Would you like to just start with that, and then I can ask you?
Did I tell you about the helpers of the Holy Soul in Hiroshima? Well, I'll go back to this story. There were two very, very fine Catholic orders of nuns that I came in contact with in Japan. They might have been in Tokyo primarily, but they might have been various missionaries, and I feel sure that they were in other cities. But I ran into the Madams of the Sacred Heart, which is primarily a school teaching group of people, and this particular, I guess you would say, home was teaching primarily all of the diplomats' children, regardless of the countries they came from, before the war took place. And it was a very fine educational institution. And this was one of the places that I walked to, and just by occasion that I met the Mother Superior of this order, and had a very interesting experience with her. And this is the time I told you that I got the GI men to contribute money and send them over food, water, and what have you. Now, to add to that, one day, cold day, in February of 1946, I tried to walk every afternoon. I was walking along, and I had frankly forgotten that in one of my previous walks, I had taken my gloves off and given it to a sister who was carrying water. And she then handed me a letter about 6 weeks later from her brother, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, thanking me for having given his sister a pair of gloves. That's just a small thing that I was thinking about in connection with these sisters. Now, I had thought of several other things that probably be more of interest than some of the sidelights, but we'll get into any of these sidelights anytime you have the time and want to that I can think of. But the thing I'm thinking about today is the determination of General MacArthur to rebuild Japan. The fiscal year of the government used to run out on June the 30th, and new appropriations would start on July the 1st. And General MacArthur was determined to have some money sent over to be able to start the rebuilding of Japan. And he sent back to this country two very fine generals, one by the name of General Whitlock and the other by the name of General Eastwood. And they came back here, and of course they had to go through the legislative and liaison branch of the Army in Washington before they could get to see any senators. And they finally got to see Senator McKellar, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, as well as then the Vice President of the United States, because Mr. Truman then was president, and we didn't have a physical Vice President. And
that was Senator McKellar
from Tennessee. McKellar from Tennessee. And the first money that was appropriated was $650,000. And that money was sent out to Japan in July of 1946. And quite a celebration took place both on the Japanese side and on the American side, who were instrumental in getting this money for Japan to start the rebuilding of Japan. And so that's one thing with a very definite date in mind, that history should record that General MacArthur started the reconstruction of Japan. Now, I don't know whether I touched upon the story of General MacArthur meeting the emperor or not yesterday, but this is the truth, and I was not present, but I was told this by Mrs. MacArthur, so I know it to be true. They etiquette everybody, both on the Japanese side and our side, were not sure how the etiquette of General MacArthur meeting the emperor should take place. The emperor was cooperating with the Americans 100%. So they finally agreed that General MacArthur would ask the emperor to come out to his home, which was the American embassy, and have midday meal, lunch as we call it. I don't know what the Japanese, I presume they call it lunch too, but I'm not sure. Well, anyway, Ms. MacArthur was not invited to come to the table, but she told me that she hid behind the silk screens and so forth to be able to get a view of the emperor. And she couldn't help but be impressed how nice he was and how dignified he was, and that he had excellent manners. And he and the general got along perfectly, because the emperor knew that MacArthur was running the country, and his existence depended upon General MacArthur. So I thought you might be interested in that little bit of a story. That was how General MacArthur met the emperor, having him to lunch.
Let me ask you about the order of the Reconstruction. Did they work on public buildings first, or the homes of the people?
The first thing that the Japanese did with their own money, because they started this immediately. They started this, and was actually taking place very actively when I went into Japan in November of 1945, was cleaning up the roads, and the streets in Tokyo and in the other cities were taking place the same way. The roads had been completely jammed by falling debris, and the main streets in Tokyo, with the exception of most of the Ginza, and the road around the Emperor's Palace, that most of the Ginza and the road around the Emperor's Palace had not been touched or bombed, but most of the other roads were completely jammed with debris and just trash of all kinds, and it was very difficult to get a passageway through, because the debris and the trash was so high that you couldn't barely get through one lane with our traffic, our size vehicles. So the first thing the Japanese did was work on cleaning up the roads. Then the next thing that was done, certain buildings had to be torn down before they could be rebuilt. And the Japanese, under the supervision of the Americans, began the construction of various different buildings. They had to have the approval of the American government as to which building had priority, which would come first. And so the first money that came in from the Americans was helping to reconstruct some of the office buildings, which later the Americans used, but were primarily for the Japanese. That's my recollection of the use of the first money. The Japanese had sufficient food in storage. I don't think that any of that money went to buy food. I'm not sure, but I don't think it did. Then they had gardens. Most of them then had small gardens. And with spring coming on, why they began to be able to have food that they're raising themselves. But whatever food they had before that was food that had been saved. But the money started to come in to be able to, I guess it's a painting with a very broad brush, you would say the reconstruction of Japan. Primarily, the cities that were destroyed the most, besides Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was first of all Tokyo, second Yokohama, third Kyoto, and I would assume certain portions of the city right next to Kyoto that had been badly bombed. The other cities outlying from Tokyo had been hit by pure and simply accident of a navigator missing the point in his bombing in some city, just being unfortunate enough to be under where that bomb fell. But people have no idea. I would say very conservative that the primary cities that we bombed, and especially the firebombing, were 90% destroyed.
Well, what was the attitude of the Japanese people who were living in those cities toward you and toward all the Americans that were there, GIs and all?
They had two attitudes. One, they wanted to cooperate and do anything they could for an American, and the other is they were scared to death not to do it. And they cooperated. And I never ran across a silly Japanese the whole time I was there. I never ran across anybody that was anything but just grateful that the Americans were there and treating them the way they were being treated, because they'd been told that if we went in there, they'd all be killed and they'd all be run up into the hills there. But that was not so. So they were very appreciative, and all they wanted to do was do anything that they could.
Well, did they go on with just regular in their daily lives, in their business,
Well, they had to rebuild their businesses, so they did have a daily life, and lots of them worked for the Americans, for us, and they were in various different capacities for us. I can think a lot of them were cleaners, day laborers, and of course there were others, and there were people there who were librarians who were trying to be of help. So there was nothing in the world that I saw except for the Japanese to cooperate with the Americans.
Well, what else can you tell me? I'm sure you have a lot more stories to tell.
Well, I told you about the first day that the money came in there, the $650,000 in the celebration that took place on that. Now, I was trying to think, and I did think, of a couple of funny instances, and I'll have to try to see whether or not that I can get them in the right. The height of any Japanese ambition was to be able to invite preferably as high-ranking officers as he could get to come out and have dinner at a Gishi house. And a Gishi house, I went to several Gishi houses. One with a man they called Senator Imai. He had been a local state senator there. He was practically in his 90s when I met him, and a very fine person. He was the head of the Katakura Silk Company, and before the war they had about 90,000 employees over Japan getting silk for them, and then they exported a tremendous amount of that to this country. Of course, all the exporting had been long since stopped. he was very anxious to have me have dinner at a Geisha house. He had a firm of lawyers in New York who had represented him before the war, who wrote a letter to some friends of mine in Washington, and they passed the letter on to me to asking somebody, and me receiving this letter, called Senator LeMay and asked him to meet with us. So I got this letter, and from a request of a friend of mine that he had received from the New York friends of his who had formerly represented the Katakura Silk Company. So for us to be able to get to a Japanese national, we had to put a request in that we wanted to see this Japanese national. So I put a request in to see Senator LeMay. And in about 2 days, it took about that long for the paperwork to work its way from one office to another. Two men, Mr. Kimura and Mr. Hanoka, came to see me. And they were very, very apologetic, and they didn't know how to start the conversation off. They were afraid that since I had sent for Senator LeMay, that he was going to be indicted because I worked for this prosecution section, and they just wondered what the charge was. And I said, he's not going to be indicted at all, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't know of anybody that has any desire to indict him. Well, they just were happiest people you could humanly possibly see. So they insisted that I go to one of these Geisha houses where he was well known, apparently very prominent citizen there in Tokyo, and have dinner. So the only way that I wanted to go was to follow them in their car, and you have to realize that they didn't have any gasoline, and their car was a charcoal burner. So we agreed that they would drive up in front of the Imperial Hotel about 6 o'clock at night, and my Japanese driver in a GI car would follow them to the Geisha house. I have no idea where the Geisha house was in Tokyo today, but when we got there, there must have been 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of these Geisha girls on the outside there bowing and scraping when I came in. And the owner and the owner of another Geisha house, both of them very smart, knew human nature, and I enjoyed both of them, and I'll tell you the story about the next one in just a minute. Well, anyway, Senator LeMay was there, and I didn't like Japanese food. I didn't eat Japanese food, and I didn't want to take any food away from them, so I told them when the time had these little plates that come around that I didn't want anything to eat. Of course, they were very offended that I didn't eat anything. But the main thing that they were interested in, besides making this contact with me, was the fact that they hadn't had any whiskey. So the next day or two, I sent them around a bottle of whiskey. So I was asked every time I could turn around, but I couldn't go at all. Another very influential Japanese that I met that I enjoyed very much was a man by the name, I'll have to think of his name, it'll come to me, but he was the former president of the Mitsui Company, and he had been stationed around the world for Mitsui, which at that time was the largest Japanese company in business. Didn't have the number of employees that Senator LeMay had in the silk company, but they had very influential and very prominent organization. And so through the same sort of connection, but with different people, well, I met him, and he had been a prisoner of war and had been at Greenbrier, West Virginia, as a prisoner of war here in America because he happened to be in America on Japanese business when war was declared. So he was interned to Greenbrier and had been sent back to Japan. He had a madam who had another very large Geisha house, and I went there and enjoyed it. But I had sense enough at this time to take for him, and we became very good friends. Several days later, I received a call from Colonel Bunker in General MacArthur's office. I don't know why it picked me out. Wanted to know if I had any connections to get him some. There were 19 congressmen and 2 United States senators there on an inspection tour, and they had to go and see a geisha house. And they wanted to know if I could take them into a geisha house. So I told them that I could, tell Colonel Bunker that I felt sure that I could arrange it. The madam of the geisha house where I went the second time had given me a card. She spoke just a little bit of English. So I telephoned her and told her in my best few words of Japanese, she spoke a few words of English and very smart, that I wanted to bring 21 Americans there at 7 o'clock that night. She wanted to know who was going to pay for it. And I can now think of the man's name who was president of Mitsui. His name was Miyazaki. I said, Miyazaki will pay for it. And I said, I'll refund the money to Miyazaki the next day. See, she said, well, that'll be fine and dandy. But she didn't use the words fine and dandy, but she said that was okay. But she said, please tell them no sleep, that they don't sleep with these girls. So I said, I'll pass that on. So then the next question was, who was going to be the interpreter? I told her that I would be the interpreter. Well, she died laughing when she said I would be the interpreter. Well, we showed up at the Imperial Hotel with 4 or 5 cars and picked up the congressmen and the senators. And I had her car, and I gave her card to the driver, and we started out. And I felt like we were going the wrong way, and I had handed him the card upside down. So we had to take the card out and show it to a policeman. He turned it around and got us to this geisha house. And of course, she had all these girls out on the porch there, and to take your shoes off and entertain. And they put on quite a show. And then we got them back to the hotel. But I had told them before I went out there wasn't any sleeping with any of these girls. So everything was fine. So the next day, I called Miyazaki. He said that she had already called him and told him about this, and he just died laughing when she told him that I was the interpreter. So I settled up with him. I think it was something like 5,000 yen, which in those days didn't amount to anything. But anyway, I settled up with Miyazaki and had always a good time with this, I guess you call it madam, I'm not quite sure, but she was the boss. She ran it. And I went there several other times with Miyazaki, but I never ate anything. And I'd always bring them some whiskey because they couldn't get whiskey. So that's one sidelight. On the lighter side of life, I got to enjoy a little bit in Japan.
Well, I wanted to ask you, in your social dealings with these people, about the language. Did you have to learn quite a lot of Japanese?
I didn't learn any. You pick it up, or you just pick up a certain amount because you use a certain amount, and you hear certain expressions or certain things being used, and you know what they're talking about. But the man like Miyazaki, like Senator Imai, spoke fluent English. There wasn't any problem there. The problem was 1 or 2 levels down, but there was never any problem at the top. There either was an interpreter. If there was anything official, there was always an interpreter. Anything unofficial, why, there was usually just somebody that knew what the language was and could be able to do it. But official, why, you always had an American interpreter, and whatever his interpretation was, regardless of how the Japanese interpreter translated, the American interpreter was the official interpretation of whatever was said.
Well, going back to the trials, too, the language used in the trials, I suppose.
It was there all the time. No question about that, where they understood exactly everything.
Like United Nations or something, where they have interpreters.
Yeah, had interpreters there all the time. Then we furnished to each one of the defendants, when I say we as Americans, a U.S. lawyer as well as he had his own local Japanese lawyer. And so every defendant there had two lawyers, a Japanese lawyer and the other an American lawyer, which was usually a captain or somebody, or a civilian who had been given a rank. Every civilian that came out was given a rank, and he lived by that rank, and he had cause by that rank, and he ate by that rank. And a lot of civilians then began coming out to be employed.
Well, going back to the trials again, how long did the trials last?
Approximately 3 years.
3 years.
And lots of them were executed, and some of them were given long sentences. And I don't remember any of them being not guilty. As I said yesterday, the Indian judge and voted not guilty on everything for every Japanese. And I don't really know now why they had the Indians to participate, but there were 11 countries, including India, and the vote was always 8 and 9, most cases 10-1 on any important cases in the trial.
Well, do you want to tell me some more now? And I've got some more questions here.
Let me have the questions.
All right. Let me see. Well, maybe we covered this. Oh yes. In Japan, at the time of the trials, was there? Of course, nowadays we get the news practically before it happens, you know. But was there news coverage, and was the information given out to the Japanese people during these trials?
They had a daily.
They had a daily?
No, they had the news daily. There were several newspapers being printed in Tokyo, and they had both in Japanese and the U.S. had an army paper out there that lots of them read in English, but the translations and everything were in Japan. They had that in the local Tokyo papers every day.
Well, I thought maybe that information was kept from the local people.
No, they knew everything that was going on. And most of the local people turned against their former officials. The local people were turned against their officials.
The ones you mean who were being tried?
Because they got them into war, and they carried on this abuse, and they carried on the harsh treatment of prisoners that they had taken, and had people killed unnecessarily, and that was the reason that they were found guilty and were hung.
Well, that's about all the questions that I had here. I did want to ask you one thing, but this goes way back. But where were you at the time that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I was on the island of Guam. That was General LeMay's headquarters, and General LeMay had one of the groups, I think it was the 469th group, that was trained in secret back in this country up in the mountains of Utah. Didn't anybody know where they were. General LeMay was not the commanding officer of them when they were trained in this country, but when they came out to Japan, he of course was a commanding officer. And the orders to drop the bomb, of course, was sent from Mr. Truman to the Secretary of War, who then gave it to Washington, who ordered LeMay to have the bomb dropped. Then this group had been trained with some secret mission. They didn't really know what they were doing. They had no idea, in my opinion. I only knew them, really, I didn't know them in training. I just knew them socially afterwards, never close to them, socially or physically. But we knew each other, that's all. But I don't think they had any idea of what they were dropping. They thought it was some very important and very powerful weapon. There isn't any question in my mind that they thought that, but they had no idea what they were dropping. And they had never been briefed on anything except to drop this and get out of the way. But that was one of the groups. There was the same group dropped both bombs, different crews, different planes.
I've got to